So far in our discussion of all these puzzles, we've made an assumption. This is an assumption that we now need to call into question, as it has been the subject of much debate among metaphysicians in recent years. What we've been assuming all along is that individual particles, objects of the kind fundamental physics discovers, like electrons, quarks, and so on, combine at least some of the time to form collections of atoms, lumps of clay, hunks of organic material. So for instance, when Quine says he has no problems with individual animals, he's still saying there are individual animals, right? There's a cat there. As a beginning, a middle, and end. It has an outline. It's a cat. It's a thing. We have asked about particular collections of atoms, whether they constitute ships or people, but some philosophers think we need an argument that these collections of atoms themselves exist. And notice, not the atoms, but the collections of atoms, if they themselves exist. As Peter van Inwagen notes in his 1990 book, Material Beings, perhaps individual particles never combine to form composite objects, or perhaps they do sometimes, but not always. Maybe, although some particles exist, there is no such thing as the collection of these particles. In Material Beings, the question van Inwagen wants to address is, in what circumstances do some objects compose something? And if you know what we've just done, that's exactly what we were exploring. In what circumstances do some objects compose something? He calls this the special composition question. The general composition question is, what is composed composition? But this is, in what circumstances is a thing a thing? It's worth emphasizing how it is that our presentation of all of the earlier puzzles and paradoxes made one crucial assumption, that composition occurs at least some of the time. This is most obvious in the first two puzzles, which we haven't discussed, but you know the ship of Theseus, for example. We'll discuss it next week. There we started by assuming in the first place that there were some planks of wood and that these compose a ship. Or we assumed that there was a lump of clay and that at midnight this was sculpted to compose a statue. Or in our case, we assumed that there were cats and tigers and lions. Lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. But even in our presentation of the problem of the many, you don't need to know what that was, it's a part that I skipped, we assume that composition occurs at least some of the time. After all, we assumed that there were all of these collections of atoms, so a collection or collection minus one atom or minus two atoms and so on. But to assume there's a collection of atoms is to say that the atoms have composed something, if only the collection. And what van Inwagen wants to make us see is that perhaps there isn't any such thing as the collection of atoms, C or C minus, C minus minus, however many number of atoms, and you can imagine them making up a burger. Perhaps just the atoms exist, and these individual things never come together to form an object that is made of them. What we will refer to as their mereological sum or their fusion. A mereological sum is sum of the objects x1, x2, x3, and so on is the object that contains x1, x2, x3 as parts. So it's the sum. You want to say that the burger is the sum of its ingredients, and you want to say that the burger bun is the sum of all of its particles. And the question is, at what point do we want to say there are sums? In order to state the special composition question precisely and accurately, van Inwagen notes that it is necessary to introduce a new kind of logical apparatus, that of plural quantification. To see the standard first-order quantificational apparatus is not able to give us a way to draw the distinctions we want. Consider how we would have to translate the sentence, the electrons exist. We would be forced to translate this as, there exists an X such that X is the electrons. This entails that there is such a thing as the electrons, and hence that composition occurs. Instead, we would like a way to speak plurally about the electrons without assuming that there is any one thing that they composed referred to by the expression the electrons. So you can imagine if I make a drawing here, I want to talk about all these red dots, right? These blue dots, but I don't want to talk about their being together. How can I talk about the blue dots without their being together? That's what van Inwagen says, because he doesn't want to beg the question. He doesn't want to assume the very thing he's trying to prove. if talking about the blue dots, all of the blue dots, commits me to saying they're a collection, hence the purple line, I've essentially done a move without arguing for it. Can everyone see that? If I say I refer to all the blue dots, but then the all commits me to the purple line, I've kind of smuggled in a composition without arguing for it. That's a big deal, right? Because the metaphysician is going to say, slow the hell down. So we want to be able to talk about, we want to reference, if you will, right, to pick out these, all of them. So that's all. That's a serious all, right? We want to pick out all of them. And I'm not going to do all the arrows, but we don't want to pick out this totality. So you want arrows going to each and every single one, right? In order to be able to say something like the electrons exist without smuggling in a grouping. And Ariana asks, is it like wanting to talk about the lettuce but not the burger? No, because the lettuce would be, no, it's more like the lettuce would be one part. The lettuce would be like this, Ariana. The lettuce would be like my wanting to pick out just this. And it's clear that if I pick out just this, I'm not smuggling in the purple line. Do you see that, Ariana? Yeah. So let's say these are the ingredients. Let's say the purple dots are the ingredients of the burger. And I want to pick out all of the ingredients of the burger without supposing or putting into a kind of already in a position of having to sort of a position of power argumentatively without really having been argued, right? The whole. Do you see that? So I want to talk about all of the ingredients that we could list earlier about the burger without talking about them somehow composing something further than them just being each one what they are. Folks, tell me if that's clear. If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask a question. It's a great question, Ariana. You're actively making connections, and that's what we want to do. And thank you, right? Because I'm only as good as your questions, right? So he wants to find a way, let's say, to talk about this, right? Because if you say that there is an X such that X is the electrons, this entails that there is such a thing as the electrons, and hence that composition occurs. But that's contentious. Instead, we should like a way to speak plurally about the electrons. I like that word, plurally about the electrons, without assuming there's any one thing that they compose referred to by the expression the electrons. So we want to speak plurally about the ingredients without assuming that they form this new thing called a burger. Following Van Inwagen, then, we use for all x's, so look, x's in the plural, because we want to talk about plurally, right? So imagine this S now just stands for plural, so x's. There exists an x's, right? The x's, there exist the x's, to mean the same as the English phrase, there exists some x's. We will also use plural variables, the x's, to refer to these x's. This will allow us to speak of them plurally without automatically assuming that there is something, there is an x, right, that is the sum or collection of the x's. This would assume already that composition does occur. We can then translate the electrons exists as there exist x's such that the x's are the electrons. And here we're picking out the blue dots without smuggling in their totality. Well, no, their totality, yes, but not as a composed totality. This is important. Then the official formulation of the special composition question will be this. For any x's, when is it true that for all other things, the x's compose that other thing? We may state this in quasi-English as, for any x's, when is it true that there exists a y such that the x's compose y? So when do ingredients make a dish? Possible answers to this question will all be of the form, for all x's, and for this thing y, the x's will compose that y if and only if the x's, and then the hard part is filling out this part here. That's what we were doing earlier, right? So you can imagine the ingredients are here, right? For all the x's, that's all the ingredients. And for this thing called a burger, the ingredients will compose a burger if and only if, so that's a biconditional, if and only if, right? It's a necessary and sufficient condition. Those ingredients, and then WTF. What in the world is the answer to that one? When is a thing a thing? So you take all of those parts, what has to happen in order for them to be what they are? So we did this. Let's go to the next page. Where the ellipsis, ... is filled by a condition one might argue is required to get any x's to compose something. And as we saw, you got your work cut out for you. Note how general an issue this is. Answers to the special composition question will tell us what it takes for any objects whatsoever to compose something. Some metaphysicians believe there is a particularly interesting class of objects, simples or mereological atoms. And this goes back to the question that Carl was asking when we started off, right? Simples. Simples are objects that have no proper parts, where some x is a proper part of another object y, just in case x is a part of y and x is not identical to y. Strictly speaking, by the way, this is a weird quirk of set theory, every object is a part of itself. Set theory and mereology. Every object is a part of itself. So when we say a proper part, it's the ordinary sense of part, right? Your car is a part of your car, according to philosophers. But normally when we say a part of your car, we mean something like its tire, right? The philosopher's jargon is going to be a proper part. We'll say your tire is a proper part of your car, because we also include as parts the thing itself. Your car is a part of your car. An answer to the special composition question will tell us what it takes for any things whatsoever to compose something, whether those things are mereological simples or mereologically complex objects. So Agassi writes, is it like the required part of something? Well, let me see if that sheds some light of what you said, Agassi. So let's go back to the burger, right? The burger, this is my burger right now. Let's make a simplified burger. This is the bun, the top bun and the bottom bun. And let's make a meat patty. And there we have it. It's a super basic little icon of a burger. There's these are 3 parts, right, of this whole thing that add up to being this burger. So they're parts of this thing called a burger. But each one, if you look more closely at this, let's zoom in. If you look more closely at this bun, you just zoom in for the bun here, right? If you go at the bun, right, the bun itself is a whole with parts. Like if you were to zoom in, right, on the bun even more, what would you see? Like if you think about the bun, how is it itself a whole with parts? Like if we were to imagine it's got parts. You know about bread. Tell me a little bit about like how the fact that it's got parts. Have you ever seen a bread up close? Even a burger bun, it's got little bubbles. It's got little bubbles. It's got little grains, maybe water, yeast, salt, flour. Yeah, and some of them have merged, some of them haven't. It's got lots of little things, right? It's a whole as well. So notice now, this kind of justifies the claim, or it illustrates the claim, right? An answer to the special composition question will tell us what it takes for anything whatsoever to compose something, right? This is what we want to find. An answer that will tell us what it takes for anything whatsoever to compose something, whether those things are mereological simples or mereologically complex objects. So the bun right now, is it a mereological simple or a mereological complex object? So MS or MCO? It's an MCO, that's right. It's a mereologically complex object which serves as a part of another whole. So is itself that. But if you can imagine this kind of fractal, this kind of, this is Dr. Strange on crack fractal, you want to have a story that ranges over every part-whole relation at whatever scale that will give you the general outline of a theory. When is a thing a whole? When do parts add up to a whole, right? And that would be an answer to the special composition question. It's like, because we always help ourselves intuitively. Like, do you remember we didn't have a mountain detector, right? None of us have this organ that's a mountain detector. It's not obvious that we have a hole detector as well. WHO, right? And simple means irreducible. Yeah, it has no parts, right? So you can imagine if, let's say the Tesseract in Marvel, let's say, right? Imagine it can't be split, right? It's just like, it's this cube of, I don't know, like there's no possible world in which you split it, then it's a simple, right? It's not so much that it's small, but it is simple. Of course, when we reach simplicity, typically we reach the very small. But you can imagine something that's a handheld size, but if it has no parts, right, then it would be simple. right? So there you have it. Although you might argue, well, it's a 3D figure. I don't know if the sides compose parts of it, but whatever, right? Yeah. Does it have to be only physically splittable? Well, yeah, because we're talking about reality, right? The fact that you can think of it in terms of dimensions, right? So this is an act of what we call precisive abstraction. You can, in fact, divide further, but at this point, you're not dividing the world, you're dividing your mind, right? So if you distinguish, for instance, a triangle with its trilateral, the triangle has both its trilateral and its triangular. So the triangularity and the trilaterality, the fact that it has 3 corners and the fact that it has 3 sides, you distinguish that in thought, but the triangle is both, right? It is both triangular and trilateral. It's not like you can make a triangle that's just triangular but not trilateral. Like, try that. You can't split that atom. That atom is like unsplittable, but you can split it with your mind. We can conceptually distinguish in what Duns Scotus called a formal distinction between its trilaterality and triangularity. So yeah, but a simple, we know what it is. What qualifies as a simple? That's a separate question. But a simple would be something without parts. It may help to note another way of understanding the special composition question. Although Van Inwagen insists this is not the official formulation of the composition question, he notes that this more practical formulation may help to see what the issue is at stake. Suppose we had a certain non-overlapping objects, the x's, at our disposal. What would one have to do? What could one do to get the x's to compose something? So it's a game of Lego blocks with God, right? Like, imagine God gives you a drawer full of molecules and atoms, right? Or even molecules is already starting too high because they're complex. Whatever the simples are, I give you a drawer full of them. How do I have to put them together for them to be a thing? Like when you buy, let's say you go to the Lego store and you buy a Star Wars Lego kit, it doesn't come arranged, it comes loose. And you think, well, I'll follow the instructions and it'll make the Millennium Falcon. But what would I have to do? What could one do to get all these X's, the independent Lego blocks, to actually compose something that I can turn around and say, it is a whole? Does everyone see that? You like that Lego example? Type in clear if that's clear. Ask a question if you got a question. Because I really want us to grasp the problem before we start moving on to possible solutions. Right? It's like, here's a bunch of ingredients. Here's a bunch of Lego blocks. The ingredients we've just seen with the bun aren't simple themselves. Help yourself to a drawer full of simples. When are they a thing? Right? Are they ever a thing? Not just when. If, right, they're a thing. Like, you have to even, you can't beg that question. So answers to the special composition fall under 2 types: moderate answers and extreme answers. Moderate answers are those that entail that at least some of the time, some objects, the x's, come together to compose a new thing, but also entail that this does not happen all the time. Extreme answers to the special composition are those that entail either that composition occurs all the time for any x's whatsoever that we consider, or that composition occurs none of the time, at least no distinct objects ever combine to form a new object. Everything trivially composes itself. In the remaining sections of this chapter, we will introduce the various answers that have been proposed so that the reader may assess for him or herself what to think about the issues that Van Inwagen raises. Like when you have a Millennium Falcon, you still have just a bunch of Lego pieces, right? When you have a human with a bunch of organs you put together, do you have something more than just a bunch of stuff you put together, right? When you have H2O molecule, is the H2O more than H and 2O, right? It's like, well, you're answering yes, you're answering no. There are many different answers. So let's look at moderate answers, right? Moderate answers. So let's put them on a spectrum. So let me just rephrase what was just said a moment ago, because I don't want us to gloss over this. There are extreme and moderate answers. Extreme answers come in 2 categories, right? There are never any compositions. That's extreme. That never happens. Things don't ever get together. The simples never get together to form a composition, a whole. Another extreme answer is, yeah, man, whatever you want to lawsuit together, that's a whole. So the top half of my burger and the bottom half of the burger in Singapore, that's a whole. And my one block and the block in the Lego store, that's a whole, right? That's another extreme answer. Whatever combination of simples you propose, ergo whole, therefore whole. And then there's these moderate answers that are over here. And moderate answers are somewhere between the two. It's like sometimes they happen. It's like, all right, so let's say, let's say most of you are probably, when you come in to do this question, probably like common sense is a moderate answer. So for instance, if I put together all of the parts of a car together and they form a car, I think common sense is going to be moderate and it's going to say, yes, we have, when it's a car, it's a whole. But if you take the parts apart and you put them in a huge pile, then they're not a car anymore. So now they're not a whole. That would be a moderate answer. So moderate, I think, is where common sense is, right? Sometimes it's a whole, sometimes it isn't. And that's why we had a productive jam session about the burgers, right? We're happy to say burgers form compositions. Burgers are a composition. We have no problem with that, right? Although when we start making, we're having fun with it, then you can see why, whoa, maybe on reflection, maybe this is the thing, right? Maybe there are no compositions. That's an extreme answer. Or maybe every bloody thing I can think of is a composition. And then there you go. And those are going to be the extreme ones. We're going to look at all those possibilities. So moderate, one extreme, and another extreme. And that's a big problem. You can imagine if you don't figure this out, you're still helping yourself to cats and tigers, and you never stop to say when they, or molecules or whatever. You're helping yourself to these compositions all the time, and you've never argued them. So let's look at moderate answers. There are many different answers that are available to one who would like to answer the special composition question in a moderate way by giving an answer that entails that composition occurs only some of the time. Moderate answers are attractive to those who would like a metaphysics of material object that lines up as much as possible with our pre-theoretic beliefs about when composition does and does not occur. When we're going to do metaphysics, we're going to ask how much weight should our pre-theoretic beliefs carry? Like, you might want to say, again, who the hell cares about those? Or you might want to say a metaphysical system isn't good unless it actually rescues all of those pre-theoretic beliefs. For example, consider all of the objects of various sizes and complexity that exist on Earth. Ordinarily, we go too far in thinking about metaphysics. We think that some of these objects combine to compose more complex objects, while others do not. For example, the bricks that are piled neatly on top of one another at 10 Downing Street in London, England, do compose something, the official home and office of the UK Prime Minister. On the other hand, the fleas on the fastest dog in Scotland and the Statue of Liberty do not combine together to compose anything. So notice here, like these are the fleas on the dog of the fastest dog in Scotland. Here's the Statue of Liberty. She's holding her hand, right? That's a thing. Like common sense says no, right? That's not a thing. The Statue of Liberty is a thing. The Statue of Liberty and the fleas, not a thing. They don't compose anything we currently know of or hypothesize, or it's hard to, that's a different question, right? Are these, it's like, unless we've settled that question, yeah, the question of knowledge is still even harder to figure out. So there is no such object that is composed exactly of the fleas and of the fattest dog in Scotland and the Statue of Liberty. At least that's the moderate answer. We'll see some extreme ones, bite the bullet, say, yeah, sure. If we really wanted to, we could invent the name Fleabert and insist that this name will be used to denote the object composed of the fleas and the fattest dog in Scotland and the Statue of Liberty. And then you could say some true thing about Fleabert, by the way. You could just say Fleabert's useless, but that doesn't make it less existent, by the way. Huh? Like, as nothing, I find no use in Fleabert is not a premise that licenses the conclusion, therefore Fleabert doesn't exist. Right? So this is important. Not without a further premise. You're going to put some further premises into there to go from that. Right? Fleabert. This would just be a way of playing a game with language. Which objects exist in an objective matter, and if there is no such object as Fleabert, then inventing this name will not change that fact. So one common motivation for seeking out a moderate answer to the special composition question is to find an answer that fits well with our pre-theoretic intuitions about what objects exist. The home at 10 Downing Street does exist. Fleabert does not. One natural attempt at answering the special composition question with a moderate response is provided by the contact answer. This says, this is contact. For all x's, and remember this is the plurality of x's without question begging their collection. For all x's, and for this other thing y, the x's compose that thing y only on the condition that, and it's a necessary and sufficient condition, the x's are in contact. So notice when we're doing our burger, we kind of arrive at a contact view at some point. The rough idea is that if you have some things, to get them to compose further objects, all one needs to do is to bring them next to each other so that they touch. And there's going to be problems, as I think Carl's already seeing. And by the way, the contact question works great for burgers. My friends, the solar system. So already you can think of counterexamples, right? How much space is between each planet in the solar system? Like a lot, right? There's no contact there. In fact, there's emptiness between them. Genuine, full-on void, right? And yet we do say the solar system. And we do say the Milky Way galaxy. Here's an interesting tidbit. This is going to blow your mind. Did you know that a galaxy can pass through another galaxy because they're mostly void? That's insane, right? We tend to think of these objects like we think of if we say the galaxy is a composition, we tend to think of it in terms of the objects around us, right? And objects don't pass through other objects. But the fact is, in fact, there's so much space between the stars in a galaxy that galaxies, they'll have an effect. Their gravitational fields are going to collide and they'll warp each other in the process. But they can pass right through and like not a single thing will hit, right? Although that's unlikely. Some parts might end up colliding, but they're mostly void and they can pass through each other. So just so you know, that's going to have some problems. But I think that's just really, really wild. All right, so here we go. So the rough idea is that, yeah, if you have some things, to get them to compose some further object, all one needs to do is bring them next to each other so that they touch. What is appealing about this answer is that it seems to do well at getting the cases right that are typically used to motivate moderate responses. According to the contact view, the house at 10 Downing Street exists, but Fleabird does not, because while the bricks at 10 Downing Street are touching each other, the Statue of Liberty is not in contact with any of the fleas on the fattest dog in Scotland. However, even though there are some cases where the contact view succeeds, there are other cases where it does not. First, we often think that composition occurs in some cases, even though the composing objects are not in contact. And as I've just said, for example, the planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune together compose our solar system, and yet they're not in contact with one another. Indeed, they're separated by great distances. Van Inwagen also notes that if we should accept any ordinary cases of composition involving medium-sized objects, it seems it first needs to be the case that the fundamental particles of physics come together to compose relatively basic objects like atoms and molecules. But there isn't good reason to believe that fundamental particles like electrons and quarks compose larger objects like nuclei, atoms, and molecules by coming into contact with one another. So if you zoom in, also you got a problem. You zoom out, you got a problem, right? The galaxies, don't touch. The solar system doesn't touch. But if you zoom in, even the parts of the smallest particles that are countenanced by physics presumably don't even touch. In addition, Van Inwagen notes that there are clear cases where objects are brought into contact, and yet we don't think the composition occurs. Like when I stacked my burgers, for instance, any of you who said, no, that's two, right? We're like, there's not composition. For example, what happens if you and I shake hands? That's a good one. Now, our bodies are in contact, and yet there's no reason to think that a new object has come into existence that persists from the moment our hands meet to the moment we let go. But this is a conclusion that is entailed by the contact view. Thus, it seems we must find some other way of answering the special composition question, provided that is, once again, that you want to rescue pre-theoretic beliefs, right? So shaking hands, great example. It's contact, but it's not an additional thing. It's like us. In this book, Van Inwagen considers several other moderate answers to the special composition question that he will ultimately reject. These are fastening, cohesion, and fusion. And if we spent more time with the burgers, we all would have come up with these on our own. Fastening says that for all x's, and for this thing called y, the x's will compose the thing called y if and only if the x's are fastened to one another, where the x's are fastened when, among the many sequences in which forces of arbitrary directions and magnitudes might be applied, at most a few of them would be capable of separating them without breaking or permanently deforming them. That sounds like something fancy that Carl could have written about Triple O's burgers, right? Fastening. Commit that to memory. Your burgers are fastened because among the many sequences in which forces with arbitrary directions and magnitudes might be applied, a few of them would be capable of separating them without breaking or permanently deforming them, right? Cohesion. For all x's and for this thing y, the x's compose the y if and only if the x's cohere, where the x's cohere when they cannot be pulled apart or moved in relation to each other without breaking. And fusion. For all x's and for y, the x's compose the y if and only if the x's are fused, where the x's are fused when they are joined together such that there is no boundary. And you can see how we could have sort of kept refining common sense in our metaphysical inquiry and come up with these kinds of things. And we're kind of going in that direction if we would have kept going, right? Now, all of these improve on the contact account in some ways in making the relationship that must obtain between the x's in order for them to compose something more stable. However, each suffers from new counterexamples. Given the difficulty of stating a satisfactory moderate answer to the special composition problem, at least one metaphysician, Ned Marcosian, has proposed that we instead should seriously consider the possibility that there's no good answer to the special composition question. Marcosian takes it to be obvious that composition only occurs in some cases and not always, but takes Van Inwagen's discussion in Material Beings to support the claim that one can't formulate a true and interesting answer to this question. So notice the stance that Marcosian is taking. Yes, sometimes they make compositions, sometimes they don't compose the wholes, but we can't actually tell why. Right? So he's not saying we can't tell why. That make him an extreme position that says there are no compositions. So yeah, sometimes they can, but there's like no one overarching true and interesting answer to this question. His conclusion is that when composition occurs, it's just a brute fact. There is no metaphysical account one can point to that would distinguish cases in which composition occurs from the cases in which it does not. The house at 10 Downing Street exists and Fleabert does not, but there is nothing more to be said about these bricks or those fleas and that statue that could explain why this is so. And so the only way one can give a true answer to Van Inwagen's question would be either to say, trivially, that composition occurs when it occurs, or to list one after the other of all the cases where composition does, as a matter of fact, occur. So you use your composition detector, right? It's like one time this American senator says, when he was objecting to a certain form of contemporary art, and he said, "What is art, sir?" And he said, "I know it when I see it." Well, you can think of a composition detector as some guy who sits in a chair, and then you show him the burgers, and they're stacked this way. You go, "Yes, that's a hole." "No, that's not a hole." So you play the, and each time you say, "Why?" "Just cause." Just cause. And if you have this view, then that's brutal composition, because it's just this brute. There's no real answer. There are cases in which it's a hole. There are cases when it's not a hole, but don't inquire further. We'll know it when we see it. So forth. That's it. There's no further investigation. More precisely, it is the claim that there is no true, interesting, and finite answer to the special composition question, while maintaining that compositions exist. And again, brutal composition, this would be a mistake in a midterm, right? Brutal composition is not saying that there are no holes. It's just, I know a hole when I see it. It's a moderate answer, but I find it quite radical in its own distinctive way. Yeah, the special composition question, remember, the special composition is, when is a thing, okay, so let's take the periodic table of elements again, right, as a kind of a starting point. Let's take that. Let's imagine, Ash, I'm going to have some fun with you. I give you, well, not the periodic table of elements, because I really need to go, to go to really, really simples. So let's go for, you look it up on Wikipedia, whatever the physicists are telling you are the ultimate ingredients of the universe, right? And there's like 4, I mean, it depends on where you look, right? And there's these basic building blocks of the universe, right? And that's it. Those are the basic building blocks of the universe, typically insanely small, right? You get to have fun now. You're kind of like God at creation, time T1, and you get to combine them whichever way. Well, let's say you combine them in a way that makes a kind of a whatever pile, versus you combine them in a way that makes, let's say, a baby. Well, why is the baby a thing and not the whatever pile you made? Let's say you can randomize it. You just take all the parts, You randomly then put them together and it makes a smudge, a big glob of whatever. Is that a whole? And if you make a baby, which clearly, you know, the argument from design would say requires a hell of a lot of thought and planning, because all the parts have to work together, and you say, that's a whole. And then you step in and you ask why. Like, why is it that the baby is a whole, but the baby in a blender versus the baby, right? The baby blended, sorry, that's horrible, right? Or the burger blended. Why is the burger that's blended not a whole, but the burger a whole? Ash, do you see that? Like, I need an answer for that. That would be the special composition problem. Same matter, different form. Okay, so what's the form you got to have? To use Aristotelian terminology. Yeah. So same matter, different form. When are some forms okay? Like, at what point, if I like reconstitute, like imagine I go back and I reconstitute the burger such that it's like, if I cut it in half or I just mush it up with my hands, I squeeze it, like this is a burger, right? And I squeeze it with both palms, it's still a burger. But at one point, it's not a burger. When it's completely messed up and I put it in the blender, it's not a burger. Well, what's the cutoff point? When can I say it still is and it isn't? That's that. And you might say, well, just I can tell when I can tell. Like, it just crosses that threshold. That's the brutal composition. Oh, it just crossed the threshold. It went from being a thing to not a thing. Like, take a hammer and start smashing your table, Ash, with a sledgehammer, but don't completely demolish it at first, and take pictures with your phone. And you're going to say, here's the pictures I took with my phone. Picture 1, picture 2, picture 3, and you're smashing it gently, and, you know, like a ever ascending metal, you know, heavy metal music, let's say 1 from Metallica, and at some point where you're near the end, like, bring it, man. Start smashing that table like you hate it, like it just offended your mother, right? Okay, so like at what point is the table still a table and then it's just a bunch of parts? Like, that's the question. Like, what the hell is this dividing line in the center here, right? And the brutal compositionist is going to tell you, that was a transition just because. Do you like that example, everyone? Does that make it clearer? Trashing a table with a sledgehammer, but gently at first. You're just denting it. It's still a table. It's just a dented table. And near the end, it's like when you get to 8, it's sawdust, you know, because you're like, you know, you're like Harley Quinn on crack, you know, with her thing, right? Cool. So that's and the idea is like, well, I just know when I see it, right? I just know it when I see it. Carl says, would a brutal compositionist always give reliable answers? Well, we'd be no way to figure out whether it's reliable apart from the fact that whether it accords with what other people's intuitions are. That's the thing. We'd have no, Carl, so that's a great question, Carl. And there's nothing for us to assess the rectitude of a brutal compositionist's answers to whether or not something constitutes a whole. There's no principle you can enunciate, because if there was, you could enunciate it. And that's exactly what the brutal compositionist denies, right? Carl also writes, you could show a brutal composition as something, and their answer changes, yes, that's a burger, that's not a burger. Yeah, exactly. And I want to know, what are you consulting when you do that? That's like our mountain. We were all, so this is the thing, right? Everyone who was tempted to say, now we all are thinking brutal composition right now, we think it's kind of silly, but weren't we all kind of brutal compositionists when we said, I know a mountain when I see one? Like, be honest, you see that? We were occupying that conceptual space there for a moment. When I made fun of people with a mountain detector, that's just a way of saying, and we were brutal compositionists for the garlic presser as well. Exactly. Right? I know my hammers when I see one. It's like, wow, okay. And again, these are pre-theoretical intuitions. And Chris, we want to ask in the second half of the class, or second third and third, how much weight should these things carry? Right? Like, and should they be decisive, especially if we can't answer why, which is a big deal for we philosophers. Like, you can't answer why. Okay, so look, here's a thing. This is going to mess you up a lot. So here's a timeline, right? Here's a nice moment of conception, and here's called birth, right? So birth, conception, and some people are going to want to say that there's a human only at some point in between. Well, I know when an embryo or fetus is one when I see one, and then when I say, why'd you draw the line here? And they say, 'cause, and they call themselves brutal compositionists. Like, can you see how mountains it didn't bother us? But what if I say everything on this side of the spectrum doesn't require moral treatment, but everything on this side requires moral treatment? Like, okay, well, everything boils down to a metaphysical debate, and you're going to say, well, I know when it forms a whole. Now it's not a whole or something like that. It's just a bunch of cells. It's like, okay, this is a big deal. It's a huge deal, right? And you might also want to know, if you stack some burgers, is that just a quadruple burger, or is it just 2 burgers stacked atop, right? Chris is typing. I'll see what Chris has to say, and then we'll move on. Does the question of composition also invite the question of identity as well? Indirectly, yeah. You might want to zero in on that a little bit, but you might want to say, for instance, like, yeah, it could, in a kind of a way that we want to say, like, when is a burger identical to or not identical to something else? Yeah, kind of, yeah. But like not in a way that's unique to the composition problem. Just in a way that questions of identity are just crucial across the board. Chris, does that make sense? Cool, yeah. All right, so before we can properly evaluate whether Marcosian is right, we should try to see what other answers to the special composition question have been proposed. Then, if at the end of all this, we see reason to think any answer we attempt to give will fail, we might reluctantly come to accept that the facts about composition are brute. So there's some more answers that are here. Right? According to Van Inwagen, there is something in virtue of which certain x's come together to compose a new object. But this isn't to be understood in terms of the x's spatial positions relative to one another. So hold on to your seats, kids, because you're about to hear a very surprising view. All right, so hold on to your seats. All of the accounts that make whether composition occurs rest on objects' relative spatial positions fall prey to counterexamples. Nonetheless, Van Inwagen is certain that at least one mereological complex material object exists, himself. And so there must be something about the objects that compose him that makes composition occur. This is important. I feel like in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when a guy does his mashed potatoes and he says, this means something. This is a big deal. And sounds like Descartes-esque, but you can pull him in a different direction because Descartes had a thinking thing, right? He's going to want to say, for instance, right, that there's no assumption about dualism in there, Sumaya, right? So, for instance, if I say, I, Mark, am made only of matter, but you know what? I know I'm a thing, right? Look at me, like here I am. I'm in, like, you know, I'm a thing, right? I don't need to kind of smuggle in Cartesian substance dualism to say that. Right? Like, aren't I a thing? Like, don't I have knowledge of my boundary conditions? Like Sumaya and everybody else, let's have some fun together. And it's not so much an argument for intelligent design. That would be too strong an argument, a too strong conclusion to draw from that. It's an argument for the existence of humans or persons, or at least one person, Van Inwagen, right? And you, right? Which is might be something you want to have in the mix, right? But let me have some fun for a second. Suppose, and again, let's test this for just a moment. And just to show you how you don't have to go to the reflex of saying Descartes. Suppose I tell you I'm going to clip your nail, and suppose I'm telling you I'm going to cut off your arm. What do you prefer? I'm going to clip your nails, or I'm going to chop off your arm. What do you prefer? Well, why? You kind of know your boundaries, don't you? You kind of know your boundary conditions. Right? Like you're a whole, you're a composite, and importantly so, right? You know that there's these parts you can let go, but there's something more to the sum of your parts. And so that's what he's going to say. And you don't, just to show you, you don't need to make any presuppositions about some ghostly mind that floats above the body. You can make the argument just with the conditions, the boundary conditions of your body. Sumaya and everybody else, is that clear? Like, it needn't be, I'm a thinking thing, I'm immaterial, therefore I am, or some crap, right? Which is not needed. It would still be you without your arm, but there's something about you that makes you draw that line in a non-arbitrary fashion. You see that, Sumaya? It would still be you. Your integrity as a body. And the thing is, I'm running this, and I don't know that, by the way, Van Inwagen would say that example, but it's a way of saying that you could take Van Inwagen's view, and you needn't assume Descartes into it. Because who the hell wants to solve a problem by taking on the mother of all problems, right? Van Inwagen believes that what makes some mereological atoms, and how many, by the way, how many Bigfoots do you need in order to say that Bigfoot exists? Let's rehash that quantification stuff. All right, so how many, at least one, right? How many real wholes do I need to say that wholes are at least a thing? Well, one and done. I'm a whole, one and done. Do you see that move? It's like maybe there's more, but at least there's that. And that means he's got a moderate answer. At least one. There you go. And Van Inwagen believes that what makes sense of some mereological atoms compose him is that they participate in a complex activity, the sort of complex activity that allows him to constitute a life. All right, who took free will and determinism with me? Type in yes. The last weeks that we were together. Remember what I said when I made a huge line and I said, here are all the things in the universe. And I said, the living things, what is it I said that's distinctive about living things? Do you remember? Living things are distinctive because, fill in that sentence. Something about entropy. We violate entropy. We violate the law of entropy. Living things, read a book called What is Life by Erwin Schrödinger of Schrödinger's cat, right? Erwin Schrödinger says, what is life? His answer is things that defy the law of entropy. We living things, we defy the law of entropy. We eat other things and try not to burn, and moreover replicate our parts along with instructions on their replication in order to combat heat loss and stay alive at least 70 years before we oxidize. Like we violate the laws of physics. Like one of the most fundamental laws, the law of entropy, we violate it. We postpone it, we keep it at bay for a while. And that's a way of unpacking, right, what it means to live. So the complex activity that allows them to constitute a life, you can unpack that as what Schrödinger calls negentropy. We negate entropy. That's what living things do. You have a metabolism. Why? Because you're using the laws of nature to violate the laws of nature long enough for you to live a little bit and replicate and have kids. And they can do the same. And we've been doing that for unbroken 4 billion years from the primordial ooze to you. Right? And that's a property that only living things can do when they're wholes, genuine wholes, where all the parts cooperate. So Van Inwagen's proposed answer to the special composition problem is, and this is his answer, for all x's and for the thing called y, the x's compose the y if and only if the activity of the x's constitutes a life. I told you to hold on to your seat. Was I right? Because it's not about spatial arrangement, right? It's like, no, they demonstrate a property that's unique and that's more than the sum of its parts. Like, okay, here's me on a timeline, and here's me getting killed. So I'm alive and I'm dead. What's the difference between alive and dead? And you can zoom in all you want to the moment before and after death, right? Like the difference is like there's a transition here. There's this property of combating heat loss that ceases. From there on, I start to lose heat, right? At this point, I'm generating heat and I'm fighting for my life. I'm fighting for my life. I'm eating. I'm fighting for my life. I'm having coffee. I'm drinking water. I'm combating the universe's heat loss. And at this point, it's a downward slope. That's death. And there were things I was doing on the left-hand side of this divide when I was alive that I couldn't do when I'm dead. And the reason for that isn't it's just a spatial arrangement. There's something unique about the motion in which it's engaged in. Tanya writes, I'm a bit confused. Is this proposal only for things that are alive? Therefore, this would not count for the burger because it's not alive. Tanya, you are correct. You are correct. So here's a quiz that was on the list of things to do in like if you tried the online quiz, right? Let me do this online quiz. I'm gonna type in over here. Let me write some stuff here. I'm gonna say 3 things: burgers, tables, mark. Burgers, tables, and mark. I need over here. Burgers, tables, mark, and quarks. Quarks. Let me put some quarks. I need some quarks in here. Let's assume quarks are simple. What exists according to Van Inwagen? These are the candidates: burgers, tables, mark, and quarks. What exists according to Van Inwagen? We haven't fully looked at his view, but give it the old college try. Mark exists, not the Mona Lisa. Quarks exist. Burgers don't exist. Tables exist. Marx exists because he's a whole made of simples, but a genuine whole. Quarks exist because they're simples. Burgers are just a collection, but they don't actually compose. Tables are just a collection, but they don't actually compose. Do you see that, everyone? Like that exists because it's simple, And this exists because it's really a composition. It's a genuine composition. There's something there. And that's a wild view, by the way. That's as far as the views that we're going to be looking at, like compared to brutal composition. I don't know about you, but shop and compare, it's pretty darn good. At least I feel, right? And it's at least a surprising view, right? And here you have human beings exist, electrons exist, but tables and chairs, planets and solar systems do not, because they're neither simples nor lives. Certainly this result is surprising, perhaps too counterintuitive if one places weight on the examples usually used to motivate the search for a moderate answer to the special composition question. However, in philosophy, just like in science, we often find that the evidence points us in the direction of what is initially counterintuitive. And that's one of the reasons why Van Inwagen is a well-respected metaphysician. He kind of does solve that problem, but in a surprising way. Carl writes, concrete biological organism seems arbitrarily exclusive. The arrangement of matter we call the Mona Lisa maintains itself quite actually over the centuries. No, actually it doesn't. I have a MA in museum studies. It's oxidizing like nobody's business. If it was alive, it'd actually do better. And so, yeah. And you can do constant restorations and projections, but who, Carl, is doing, at the risk of having a regress, who is doing constant restorations and projections, delaying the entropy of the Mona Lisa? Someone answer. Who's making sure the Mona Lisa lasts as long as possible? Living things. We can decide to maintain and combat the entropy of other things, but we're the original OG entropy deniers. That's us, right? And it all comes down to us. Why? Because Van Inwagen says we're special, and special in a way that I'm tempted. And again, if you've done free will and determinism, you'll know that I'm tempted to kind of agree with that. Exactly, and I like Carl's parallels, gorgeous. Babies couldn't battle entropy as well without caretakers, just like the Mona Lisa. That's exactly right. But without a living caretaker, right, who battles entropy, right, and keeps reproducing, because it's always a losing battle. Before moving on to discuss the two extreme answers to the special composition problem, it's worth remarking that Van Inwagen has gone some way towards trying to show that even though his view may look surprising at first, it does not necessarily need to conflict with the majority of statements we take in our everyday lives. So I'm not going to go into detail for that, but I just want to point out that, remember, we had these two boxes. And if it doesn't fit in your official box, what do you got to do? Well, you got to give a story on how the unofficial stuff can be explained in terms of the official stuff. Well, what does Van Inwagen puts in there? Simples, and living things. Anything that's not simple goes in here, provided that it's not alive. So things that aren't alive and aren't simples, right, goes in here. But he can explain them. So I won't go into those details. You can have fun reading that, right? But it's not like he has no story for those arrows. Like, he has a story for those arrows. It's a fundamental metaphysical account. A fundamental metaphysical account. I want to talk really briefly now about mereological nihilism and mereological universalism. So these are the two views I want to look at. Mereological nihilism is an extreme or moderate view. It sounds extreme. It is extreme. It is extreme. It denies that there are ever any holes. So what you have is, in the universe, so here's mereological nihilism. I'm going to make the box again. Let's have some fun with our boxes. What you have in the box is simples. That's it. There are no W's. There are no holes. All you have are simples. Of course, you have all the leftovers, and now you need to tell me a story because you want to say that it is true that there are two burgers there, or that, Ariana is not Sumaya, and like, aren't you holes? And we have to explain all of that. But the mereological nihilist is going to deny that. So if you look at this little box definition at the side here, mereological nihilism is the view that there are no complex objects, only simples. And you might want to go that route, right? But again, pick your poison, right? And there's this other view, which is the contrary to that. That's the other extreme. It's an extreme view as well. Mereological universalism. And mereological universalism, this is also, again, and you might want to ask, how much role intuitions have to play in this. There are simples. It's very rare, apart from some philosophies like Hegel and Parmenides, although Parmenides, the universe as a whole was itself a simple or a block universe, an Einsteinian block universe. They mostly have simples in the mix. Mereological universalism is going to have simples and a whole lot of holes, like a ton of holes. How many holes? Well, remember the Statue of Liberty with the fleas on the back of the fattest dog in Scotland? That's a thing. Fleabird, that's right. Thank you, Carl. Fleabird's a thing. So if you're a mereological universalist, right, the next time you grab your burger bun and you have a look at it, it doesn't even have to be related to a burger. The burger and my stopwatch are a thing. The stopwatch and your mom's hair and your blade of grass in the lawn of this random person is a thing. All the groupings you could possibly be making are a thing. Right? And again, who the hell cares what your reflexes are about this, right? There are reasons to agree with this. And what you have in the reading, and you'll have to do the reading on your own, of course, is reasons. So for instance, David Lewis, also a super well-respected metaphysician who died, but a really wacky and super brilliant guy, says, I claim that mereological composition is unrestricted. Any old class of things has a mereological sum. Whenever there are some things, no matter how disparate and unrelated, there is something composed of just those things. So using some terminology, if you believe in mereological universalism, are you left with an abundant or a sparse ontology? If that's what you have in your box, is it an abundant or sparse ontology? Remember when you did ontology last week, right? Desert or rainforest, right? Like abundant, that's a rainforest, or a desert, like sparse. Mereological universalist says there's sums, there's holes in everything you could possibly group together. It's an abundant ontology, right? Or you might say, and this is where when we're going to get in metaphysics, is mereological universalism abundant because it is super permissive about the number of holes it's going to say exist, or is it actually quite sparse because it's saying there are simples and holes and it counts for two things only, right? Like, is it like, how many things did I put in the box? 2 or infinity? And this goes back to, in metaphysics, we're concerned with types of things, not the number of token things. You saw that in the reading, right? So if we're concerned with types of things, then there's only 2 things here, not an infinity. But it's still kind of abundant. At least it's extreme, right, for this particular debate, because every whole is actually a whole. Every collection you can come up with is a whole, right? So if you're thinking of Lego blocks, all the possible combinations, right, they're a thing. They don't need to touch. They don't need to come alive. They don't need to look like the Millennium Falcon, right? None of those requirements are there. And notice what it does. You spare yourself some problems. So I'm just going to end on that note, right? When you adopt one of these views, you have pros and cons each time. And it's all a question of saying, which pros and cons do you want? So let's go back here, for instance, right? Interestingly, and here's what I just said, all the views have costs. Now that all the views have been described, we can briefly come back to the paradoxes of material constitution and see if the various views shed any light on them. So interestingly, Van Inwagen defends his own response to the special composition question by noting that it allows him an easy way out of the paradoxes of material constitution. For those involving persistence or constitution of inanimate material objects, he can simply say that there is no paradox because none of these objects exist. So the ship of Theseus, do you know the ship of Theseus? You keep switching the planks on the boat. At which point is it the same boat? Look, for Van Inwagen, that's not a problem. It's not a problem because there are no such ships. For humans, it might be a different story, right? But so long as we keep the property of living, we're fine. So when is a thing still a thing? So for instance, I clip your nails, you're still living, you're fine. So it kind of, you might say earlier when I gave you the option of clipping your nail or clipping your arm, maybe if I clip your nail and your arm in both instances you live, so you're still fine. You're still living, you're still a thing. Can you see that? It's pretty cool. That's a good trade-off. If you've been bothered by the ship of Theseus, you said, well, I buy into Van Inwagen's metaphysics, I can just go like this and wash my hands of the ship of Theseus problem. It's not a problem. I have a criterion for wholehood, living. Is it alive? It's a whole. It's not alive? It's not a whole. And other than that, there are the simples that constitute the wholes. Ship of Theseus, alive, yes or no? Well, problem solved. Who the hell cares what changes it goes through? It's arrangements. Who the hell cares, right? And likewise, you get a different haircut. You get your hair dyed. Who the hell cares how you combed your hair this morning? You're still alive. And that's really neat. And likewise, the mereological nihilist as well can give similar responses to these paradoxes and say they give one all the more reason to think that there is no such things as mereological complex objects. Like, it's just like the mereological nihilist sounds wacky, but like, hey man, I'm taking one counterintuitive position, but then I don't have to have all of these other problems. They're solved for me. Unless you've actually stopped to think about this, like you think all these questions, you don't even know they're issues. Like it doesn't even show up on your radar as a thing because you were probably a brute compositionist. I know a hole when I see one. But then when you think a little more about it, it's like, it's hard. My friends, did you enjoy today's class? Did it make you think?